Hey World Civilizations, Mr. Lassiter with you, and in this video we're going to be talking about the height of the Cold War. We're going to be looking at about 1960 to 1975, and when I say it's the height of the Cold War, I truly mean it. This is where we actually see probably the closest moment to nuclear conflict between the United States and Soviet Union that we ever came. So let's go ahead and get started looking at our video goals. I want to see what events in the early 1960s led to the increase in these tensions between the U.S. and the USSR. Describe the role of Cuba in the Cold War. Look at the Vietnam War, which is another proxy war. And then what were some defining moments of the space race? We'll wrap it up with something a little fun. So let's start off with two prominent leaders in this Cold War, Nikita Khrushchev, who you see pictured there on the left, and John F. Kennedy on the right. Khrushchev emerges as the new leader of the Soviet Union a couple years after Stalin's death. There's a little power struggle and he rises to the top. And he's actually going to lead what we call a de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union. He denounces a lot of purges under Stalin and basically tries to change some of the policies that were in place during Stalin's long reign as the Soviet dictator. He would lead USSR into the space age. They put the first satellite in space under his rule of the country. But he is going to be removed from power in the mid-1960s in favor of a guy named Leonid Brezhnev. John F. Kennedy, on the other hand, was elected president in 1960, becomes president in early 1961, and he would serve as president until he is assassinated in Dallas, Texas in 1963. But his short presidency is going to be defined both by great moments and, as you might say, epic fails. He's going to be succeeded to the presidency by Lyndon B. Johnson, who carries on the majority of the war in Vietnam. So let's talk about the Berlin Wall. This is our first of our topics today. Berlin, as you remember, was split into zones of occupation just like Russia. And Berlin was divided into the Russian sector and the Western sector, the French, British, and American sectors. And it was basically an island, or what was called a Western island, in the middle of East Germany. So the entire city was within the Soviet East Germany. And this was a problem for the Soviets because a lot of people would escape to the west through West Berlin. So let's say they were in a Soviet bloc country and they had some connections. They would make their way to East Berlin. They would walk over to West Berlin and then hop an airplane out to Western Europe, perhaps. And this was kind of an embarrassment for the Soviets. Their kind of oppressed sectors of the population in East Germany or East Berlin were able to literally just escape to the West. And so they decided to cut off this flow of refugees. And Nikita Khrushchev orders the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Now, this was a fortified barrier. It had towers with machine guns placed on them, minefields, dogs. So it wasn't just one wall that was easily hoppable. It was kind of a no man's land in between. But for President Kennedy, the construction of the wall was sort of an embarrassment. This was an early test of his presidency, and it was a challenge to America. And basically, he could do nothing to stop it. This wall would stand until 1989. Another problem facing the United States was the issue of Cuba. In 1959, during the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, a guy named Fidel Castro led a socialist revolution in Cuba. Not necessarily a communist revolution, but he overthrew the United States-supported dictator Fulgencio Batista. And so, yes, the United States had supported a dictator there, mainly because he supported American holdings in the country and American companies that did business there. Well, Fidel Castro was successful, and when he sets up his regime, the Soviet Union supports him because the U.S. had been supporting Batista. The U.S. responds by beginning an embargo or an official ban on all trade with Cuba. And also the United States sets into motion a plan to try to overthrow Castro. Basically what they do is they take these Cuban exiles, and the CIA trained them for an invasion. They were going to invade at the Bay of Pigs, which you see marked on the map to the right, and they were going to basically start a revolution to overthrow Castro. The idea was that the United States would fly in and provide air support for the invasion, and then they could cover it up with saying that Cuban pilots had wanted to overthrow Castro and they bombed things themselves and went rogue. The problem is the plan fails miserably. Kennedy, whose administration inherits this plan, decided not to send in air support. And so these Cuban exiles who invade through the Bay of Pigs are basically either killed or captured. You can see some of them pictured above being captured. And this was seen as kind of a major embarrassment. The plan comes out and Castro stays in power. After the Bay of Pigs, the USSR basically decided, this is a place that we need to support. Obviously, the United States and Cuba are not having good relations. And in 1962, the Soviet Union decides that this would be a good place to place nuclear missiles. Now, this was in response to the fact that the United States had already placed nuclear missiles in Turkey, which borders the Soviet Union. But Cuba was only 90 miles, or it still is only 90 miles from U.S. soil. And so this was very uncomfortable for Kennedy. In October of 1962, the United States, after investigating with some spy planes, realizes that the Soviet Union is sending ships carrying nuclear missiles to Cuba. And so Kennedy ordered a blockade of these Soviet ships, and it led to days and days of extremely tense negotiations between John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. And they ultimately reach a compromise. The United States agrees to remove its missiles from Turkey if the Soviet Union removes theirs from Cuba. It was the closest the world had come to nuclear war, and it changed the way the United States and Soviets communicated. For example, they installed that very next year a phone line directly between the White House and the Kremlin in Russia. So anytime they could pick up the phone and talk to each other in order to increase communication. This came very close to war. In 1992, a prominent Soviet leader said that if the United States had invaded Cuba, which was an option that was on the table but John F. Kennedy rejected, that the Soviet Union had planned to fire nuclear missiles at the United States. So extremely close and luckily avoided nuclear annihilation. But that wasn't all. The Cold War in this time period has a lot more going on. In addition, we see that there is fighting in Vietnam. So Vietnam was divided sort of like Korea. The northern part was communist and supported by communist China and Russia. The southern part was supported by the United States. It was capitalist. And the United States decided that we, as a country, could not allow communism to spread further. And we thought we had this political idea of the domino theory. If one country or region falls to communism, then those around it will fall like dominoes to communism as well. So the United States decided at first, under Kennedy's presidency, to send advisors to Vietnam. And under President Lyndon Johnson, those troops, he begins to send troops and ups the numbers of troops being sent to Vietnam and instates the draft. And so the United States basically gets bogged down in a war in the jungles of Vietnam. And despite the U.S.'s military superiority, they really struggled to defeat the North Vietnamese and a guerrilla force, the Viet Cong, in South Vietnam. Because of the growing numbers of troops and the fact that this war was reported nightly on the news, Americans became extremely tired of this war, and an anti-war movement developed in the United States, which was extremely significant. Even though we send our first people there in about 1963, the war is going to extend all the way until 1973. And until Afghanistan, it was the longest war in U.S. history. The U.S. does exit the war in 1973 with a truce line and an armistice, but 2 years later, the communists invade South Vietnam and take over the capital city there and establish a communist government for the entire country. In some ways, the United States does not technically lose battles in this war, but we certainly lost the war in terms of public opinion. It was a major embarrassment for the country's military. And the last arena that we see conflict in is space, outer space, where the United States and USSR were in a fight for supremacy in space. This was a symbol of our technological development, our education systems, our military might. So the space race became a symbol for all that. And for the most part, the U.S. was losing the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first man-made satellite into space, Sputnik 1, and really scared the United States. The U.S. the next year launches our first satellite into space, Explorer 1, but couldn't necessarily catch up to the Soviet Union right away. In 1961, on April 15th, to give you an idea how close this was in time to each other, the Soviet Union sent the first person into space, Yuri Gagarin. And just about 2 weeks later, the United States sends our first person into space, Alan Shepard. And so this space race was a very, close race, but seemingly at every step of the way, the Soviet Union was in the lead. But in 1962, John F. Kennedy kind of achieves one of the high moments of his presidency by laying out a plan to put man on the moon, as he says, by the end of the decade. And the United States is able to achieve this. In 1969, the United States became the first and only country to ever land a person on the moon. And this can be seen as the U.S. winning the space race. I like to see it as the U.S. changing the finish line and then winning the space race. But nevertheless, it was a mark of U.S. superiority. Here are your video goals. Make sure you can answer these questions. Come class, ready to learn.